that working? Well, good morning. I don't often do this, but I'm going to tell you what we're going to do before we start, so that you're not taken by surprise. If I was to give this talk a title, it would be I Have a Dream, but that title's already been taken about just over 61 years ago when I was still in the womb by a guy called, what's he called? Martin Luther King Jr. So we're going to talk about dreams and visions. We're going to do some practical advice, and then we're going to do some I had a dream stuff. And then we're going to do communion, and we're going to use that as a response. And we're going to come forward for communion. And if you have something that you need prayer for, then when you go back, the prayer team will be on the back wall. And so you can go back and you can go and pray with them. So whatever you have need this morning, God is here, and Jesus has done everything that is necessary to help you this morning. So that's what we're going to do. That's the plan. So we read in the prophet Joel that in the last days there will be dreams and visions. God speaks to people in dreams, and he speaks to people in visions. And I can remember a few years ago at Brookhouse, we had quite a few prophets there at the time. And there would often be, like there was this morning, a number of words that were given to encourage us. And so I decided that I was going to go and talk to these people afterwards and ask them how on earth it was that they knew God was speaking to them. Because you hear people speaking in church and you think, I could never do that. I could never do that. And so I went to ask them, and they'd all given words of prophecy, and I went to ask one person, and he said, well, God shows me a picture. And he shows me in this picture what he wants to say, what it means, and what he wants to say. And so that person told us what God was saying in that way. I talked to another person on the same Sunday morning, and I said, how was it that you came to give a word this morning? And they said, well, when I came into church, I had a real sense that God wanted to speak. And as the worship went on, it became apparent what it was that God wanted to say. And so by the time it came to give the word, I knew what God wanted to say. And so I said it. And I talked to another person on that same Sunday morning, and I said, you gave a word this morning. How did it come? And they said, well, I was in the worship, and God gave me 2 or 3 words. That was all, 2 or 3 words. And as I stood up to give the word, God gave the rest of the words. And it became apparent to me that all of us are different. And God knows exactly how best to communicate to us. And so, as many of you as are here, God will speak to you in different ways. God speaks to me through my conversations in my head. Some people catch me sometimes when I'm milking on my own, and they'll come in and say, who are you talking to? They think I'm talking to myself. But God invades my conversations in my head. I don't like the radio on when I'm working. I like to be able to think. And God invades my thoughts. And so, just to encourage you, God will speak to you as you can understand, in the way that you are made, and he will enable you to communicate what he's given to you to somebody else. Because the gift he's given to you isn't for you. You see all these white vans flying around the nation. They're bringing gifts to people. They're bringing gifts from the giver to the receiver. But they're the courier. It isn't their gift. They're the courier. And so often on a Sunday morning, you are the courier of the gift for somebody else. That's what it is. So that's just a practical. But I've been thinking about dreams and visions, and I've only ever spoke briefly about this once before because people don't really know what I dream about. But I'm going to tell you first about a vision that somebody had. You'll know Peter, who usually plays the organ. He's done a bunk this morning up to see his family somewhere, so we'll let him off. But his mum and dad used to be in the church, and George was a really interesting character. He was a real Pentecostal prophet. And I remember some things. I don't remember everything. I don't remember everything that people say. My wife says that I remember absolutely nothing of what she says, and I get in big trouble. But that's life, isn't it? But I remembered some things, and I remember on one occasion George had a vision, and I'm not sure whether he shared it in the church or whether he shared it with us. And he said in his vision he was sat in the congregation at the church, and he looked on towards the worship team, and he could see that all the worship team were just overcome by the power and the presence of God. And he said they were all just prostrate on the floor, absolutely lost in the moment under the power of God. And then he turned round in his vision and he saw the congregation overcome by the presence and the power of God. And that was his vision. And can I tell you that I have a dream? Now, dreams are interesting things because dreams can often take a long time to come to pass. You remember Joseph when he was a young teenager, probably somewhere in his early teens, he had a dream and he had two dreams. He had a dream about the sheaves of barley in the fields, and it said that he said that in his dream, he said the 11 sheaves bowed down to his sheaf who stood up. Well, this hacked his brothers off no end. And he had another dream, and he said the sun and moon and 11 stars bowed down to me. And his father took him aside and he said, do you mean that I will bow down to you? You and your mother, me and your mother will bow down to you? But Jacob kept these things in mind. Let me tell you, sometimes when you've got a dream, it's best to keep it to yourself. It really is. But it wasn't until Joseph was 32 years old. At 17, his brothers, who hated him, kidnapped him and sold him as a slave. And he went down to Egypt and he was bought by a guy called Potiphar. And Potiphar noticed that he was really capable and he put him in charge of his whole house. And his wife, Potiphar's wife, noticed that he was handsome and she wouldn't leave him alone. And eventually that got him in trouble and she accused him of molesting her, which wasn't true. And he ended up in prison. And it was in prison that he met two of the guys from Pharaoh's palace, and they had had dreams. Now this is what Joseph said by this time. He said, tell me your dreams, because I have a God who can understand dreams. And he interpreted the dreams for them, and they went back, and one of them was executed, and the other one was restored to his place. But he forgot about Joseph, and Joseph was still in the prison. Until Pharaoh had a dream. And he was very troubled about it, and he couldn't understand it at all. And the guy who'd been restored to his place in Pharaoh's palace said, I remember when I was in prison, there was a man there who could interpret dreams. And he told me that I would be restored to my job and that the other guy would be killed, would be executed. So Pharaoh called for Joseph, and they smartened him up and brought him in, and he was 30 years old at this point. So from 17 to 30, he'd been a slave in Egypt. But he'd had these dreams. And Pharaoh said to him, told him his dreams, and Joseph said this. He said, there is a God in heaven. I can't do it, but there's a God in heaven that can interpret your dreams. And he told Pharaoh exactly what was going to happen. So Pharaoh made him the prime minister of Egypt, the most important nation on the planet at that time. And 2 years later, Jacob found out that there was bread in Egypt. This would be 7 years later. 7 years later, because there had been 5 years of plenty. 7 years of plenty in which he'd saved all the grain. And then Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, and 2 years into the famine. So Joseph was getting on now. He was about 39 by this time. And his brothers came. And he didn't tell them who he was. They didn't recognize him. And they came once or twice. And then he told them who he was. And it says Joseph remembered the dream. But he never said anything about it. He forgave his brothers because he said, what you meant for bad, God has used for good. And you know that the fact that Joseph was saved meant that Jacob and his family were saved. It also meant that the line that would lead right to the Messiah was saved too. And so dreams are important. But dreams can take time to develop. And God gave me a dream. I have a dream. I have a dream that one day I will be in a place where the glory of God will fall in such a way that the priests, the leaders, can't operate. That they have to come out of the place because the presence of God is so heavy in the place. Just once before I die, I would like that to happen. So I'd like to look at a few things in the Bible about the glory. And probably the first time we come up against this is in Exodus 33. Moses had a wonderful experience with God. Moses said to God, he said, "Please show me your glory." Then God said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." But God said, "You cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live. So it shall be, while my glory passes by, that I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand while I pass by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back." So I'm not sure what God's glory looks like because Moses only saw the back. In Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah is called, you see a picture there. He said, I saw God, and the train of his robe filled the temple. And the angels were flying. There were seraphim flying. It said they covered their feet. With 2 wings they covered their face. And with 2 wings they flew. They had 6 wings. And so they were hiding their face. The angels were hiding their face from the glory of God. It's an amazing thing. Too wonderful to look at. In Matthew's Gospel, it talks about the transfiguration. When Jesus went up onto the mountain and he took James and John and Peter with him. And this is Matthew and chapter 17. And this is an amazing thing that happens here. Jesus took Peter, James and John his brother and led them up on a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared with him, talking with him. And then Peter answered and said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But whilst he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces, and they were greatly afraid. But Jesus came and touched them and said, "Arise and do not be afraid." And they lifted up their eyes, and they saw nobody but Jesus. I've been thinking about that, you know. If you were at a place where Jesus, Moses, and Elijah were having a conversation, wouldn't you have taken notes? Well, really, wouldn't you? Wouldn't it have been interesting? 3 of the greatest people possibly that have lived on this planet. And we know absolutely nothing of the conversation. The only thing that they recorded was that it was so bright and everyone was so light, and that the cloud of God's presence came and God spoke. They remembered what God said. They remembered what God said, and they saw some of the glory, but they hid their faces from it. And I think sometimes that whilst God has given me a dream, it's not a dream that I had when I was asleep. It's a golden nugget that God has put in to my heart that just will not go away. That's the sort of dream it is. That's the sort of dream it is. A dream to see, to be in a place where I can hide my face from God's glory, where I can hear his voice speaking to me. And just one last incident, and this is really what set me thinking. It's the dedication of Solomon's temple. And we find that in 2 Chronicles and chapter 5. So then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, to the most holy place under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. The poles extended so the ends of the poles of the ark could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from the outside. Nothing was in the ark except the 2 tablets which Moses put there at Horeb, when God made a covenant with the children of Israel, when they came out of Egypt. And it came to pass when the priests came out of the most holy place, for all the priests who were present had sanctified themselves without keeping to the rota. And the Levites who were singers, all of those of Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun with their sons. Do you know these guys, these 3 guys were appointed over 40 years ago by David when he set up worship in front of the ark. And they wheeled the old boys out for this special occasion. And I tell you what, if you have a special occasion like this, I want you to wheel me out. I really do. I don't care if I'm in a wheelchair or a stretcher. I want to be there when the glory of God falls in the place. And it says this, and they stood at the east end of the altar clothed in white linen, having cymbals, stringed instruments, and harps, and with them 120 priests, sounding with trumpets. And indeed, when it came to pass, when the trumpeters and the singers were as one, to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking the Lord, and were lifting up their voices with the trumpets and cymbals and the instruments of music, and praise the Lord, saying, For he is good, for his mercy endures forever, that the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house. I want to tell you something practical. When you appoint a pastor for this church, it's important that the pastor and the worship leader are on the same page. Because when the pastor and the worship leader are united, this is one of the conditions that is necessary for the glory of the Lord to fall. Now you cannot program this in. You cannot do this, and this, and the glory of the Lord will fall. But if you don't do some things, then the glory of the Lord won't. Unless there is unity in the place, unless there's unity with the leaders at the top, then the glory of the Lord will not fall on the church. That's really, really important. We've found that as a team of leaders, that we've come to a place of unity, which is really difficult when you get 5 alpha males in the same room who all have their own ideas about how things should be done and are all very clear that they are right, and my wife will confirm that all the time. But you realize that when God gives you the unity, when Paul said, keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, you cannot create that unity, but when God gives it you, it's so precious that you keep your mouth shut on some occasions. And you let God speak, because God speaks a lot better than you do. So it's so important for that. You know, the priests blowing the trumpets. Not that priests always blow their own trumpets, but the priests were blowing the trumpets. They were at unity with the worshippers to make one sound in worshipping God. And that's so important if we're going to do that. But you read a bit further, Solomon prayed for a whole chapter. And then the fire fell and consumed the sacrifice. And the thing that's been on my heart about this is that, okay, it's a wonderful dream to be in a place where the glory of God falls. It's a wonderful thing to hear the voice of God. But is there fire in your heart? Has the fire fallen and taken the sacrifice that you've offered? Is there fire in your soul? Have you got that passion for God, that burning passion that is uncontrollable, the sort of passion that the disciples had after they'd been arrested and beaten several times? And the priests told them they weren't to talk about Jesus again, and they said, but we cannot but tell of what we have seen and heard. We cannot but tell of what we've seen and heard. Have you got that passion? Have you got that fire in your soul? Oh yes, you're saved. You love Jesus. You're serving him. But is that passion burning in your soul? We're going to use communion as a means of response. And so first of all, let us pray. Let us just pray quietly. And let us draw near